Chapter 1 The Althusserian Definition of Theory Alain Badiou. What does Althusser have in mind when he uses the word theory? This word, in some sense, in reading capital, is what I would call a master word. The exact intention of Louis Althusser is to formulate a proof that capital is, I quote, the absolute beginning of the history of a science, RCC 13. 1 and the provisional definition of science, the absolute beginning of which he speaks, is the theory of history. So, the problem is to give a proof that, reading capital, we can identify the absolute beginning of the theory of history. And so, we find the word theory present at the very beginning of Althusser's investigation, as he summarizes the intellectual strategy of reading capital. But, immediately, we run into difficulties. First, what exactly constitutes the absolute beginning of a science? The absolute beginning of a science is not the same thing as the pure apparition of something of theoretical value. Why? Because the birth of a theory is very often, perhaps always, the revolution of a pre-existent theory. A theory comes, in general, not in the void but by revolution, as the transformation of an old or pre-existent theory. Engels explains this point in the preface of the second volume of Capital, which is a very important reference for Althusser himself. A new theory is not the creation ex nihilo of a new theoretical dimension. In the best case, it is a complete revolution of an old theory. That is, in the case of Capital, a complete revolution of classical economic theory. So, and this is my first point, theory is not the name of newness as such, it is not pure invention. Its value is a differential one. It is the distance, the écart, between two different theories. This point will be a constans, a sort of fixed point in reading capital. All beginnings and also all contradictions must be reduced to differences. All that really exists is an articulated complex of differences. This is the principal idea of the end of Althusser's introduction, at the beginning of reading capital. The text that announces the passage from Capital to Marx's philosophy. Any theory possesses its discursive order, and thus the effective existence of a theory is always the immanent organization of concepts in the system. This is the last word of Althusser's text, system, and we shall see much more systematicity of the system in the chapters that follow, RCC 72. But of what system does Althusser speak? Of the system of thinking as a totalite, of the thinking of totalite. So, theory, as a word, becomes in the end what Althusser names quite precisely the systematicity of the system. Theory thus occurs alongside other words like totalite, thinking, and concept, while system, as systematicity, is dissolved in a complex of differences. The word theory is not a stable word, and the history of the word in Althusser's text is much more the history of a sort of vanishing, of its decomposition. So, my argument here will be something like the story of the vanishing of theory, the theoretical vanishing of theory. Theory cannot be understood, in the context of the Althusserian text, from the point of view of the dialectical relationship between theory and practice. This is a significant change from the Marxist tradition. In a common Marxist tradition, the relation between theory and practice is a very important one. Althusser is constantly attempting, in fact, to destroy this opposition between theory and practice. Why is this point so important? Why is it so important for Althusser to explain that the word theory cannot be understood from the point of view of its relationship to practice? I think it is because this constitutes the definition of the immanent materialism of Althusser, its general definition. Althusser always wants to replace the guarantee of relation by the real of production. This is the crux of Althusser's intervention. And if, after all, a dialectical relationship is a relation, it is not by itself a production. So we cannot understand clearly what constitutes a theory only by its dialectical relationship to practice. We must observe and determine to what extent that theory must also be a production, and must be by itself a production, and not in an external relationship to its opposite. Althusser affirms a new form of materialism by the destruction of the dialectical relationship between theory and practice, not a materialism of relations but a materialism of production. And this is a very important point. Consequently, we also have the impossibility of determining theory, not only as the opposite term of practice, but as a result of practices, as something which is the abstract result of concrete practices. In a common vision of the relationship between practices and theory, theory is a sort of abstract synthesis, the origin of which is practice. For Althusser, we encounter what he named pragmatism. Pragmatism is precisely defined by the idea that the verification of the truth of a theory lies in practice. Althusser affirms that a true understanding of theory must be the discovery of an immanent guarantee of truth, and not its external guarantee verified in the field of practices. Althusser is truly an immanentist thinker, at every level of its determination. A truth of a theory, if truth exists, if there is something like truth, lies purely within the theoretical process, inside the process of scientific theory and not in the form of an external guarantee. And this, naturally, introduces the question of theory as production and not as an expression, a theory which is not a result of some complex of social or historical practices. And this leads finally to the question, which will be my final question, as it is in the text of Althusser himself, the question of the productive mechanism, the productive apparatus, the materiality of production itself in the case of theory. Althusser refuses any dialectical vision of the pair theory practice. Theory cannot be understood by its relationship with practice. Not only can theory not be verified by its application in practice, but we must, in fact, destroy the very correlation between theory and practice. This is certainly a very important point of all Althusserian constructions. It constitutes not the refusal of the dialecticite of the relationship between theory and practice but the destruction of the dialectical couple itself. What then are the means of this destruction? This destruction of the dialectical pair theory-practice occurs via the affirmation that theory is a name for some particular practices. So the very opposition of the two terms is destroyed by the affirmation that theory itself must be understood as a practice. Theory is, in the strict sense of the term, a practice, a scientific or theoretical practice, RCC 61. It is clear that when you say that theory is a practice, you destroy the classical relationship between theory and practice, but when you say that, as a sort of verbal definition of theory, theory is a theoretical practice, this is hardly very interesting or novel. So the point is thus to understand, not the noun theory, but the adjective theoretical. And I think that Althusser's text orchestrates a movement, the transition from the noun theory to the adjective theoretical. And this passage is also in some sense materialist. It is materialist because it is founded by a radical assertion, which can be formulated as the statement, only practices really exist. So Althusser's idea is that the relationship of theory to practice by dialectical opposition is not really radical from the point of view of materialism. The only radical solution to this problem is to affirm that theory itself is a practice, because in a materialist vision we must assume that what exists is always so in some form of practice. And it is also an anti-dialectical passage, from the noun to the adjective. Because if all that exists in the form of practices, the question becomes that of the differential multiplicity of practices, and this differential multiplicity of practices, the difference between all forms of practice is practically summarized by a certain number of adjectives, for example, theoretical practices, technical practices, or scientific practices. So the nominal field of materialism is really the demand to transform certain nouns into adjectives. This is truly a materialist necessity, from the point of view of Althusser himself and from the point of view of the destruction of the dialectical relationship between abstraction and concrete. This is so because if you maintain the dialectical relationship between theory and practice in the form of an opposition, you naturally sustain the opposition between something concrete, the practice, and something abstract, the theory. At the same time, this opposition is not a materialist one. What is materialist is to affirm that only practices exist. But if there exist a multiplicity of different practices, we return to the idea of a complex of different differences, if you will, and theory must also be one form of practice. And so, the provisional name for this is, precisely, theoretical practices. This whole materialist vision is opposed to the idea that the Marxist theory of history is or proposes something like a hypothesis. The reason why is clear. If the Marxist theory of history proposes a hypothesis, we are in the field of pragmatism. Hypotheses must be verified by historical practices. If we don't accept that sort of pragmatism, we also refuse to say that the Marxist theory of history occurs in the form of a hypothesis. Hypothesis is, in fact, a pragmatist vision of theory. Hypotheses must be verified by the concrete realization of history itself, by the concretization of history. And in some sense, history is also of a dialectical nature because it opens the field of the possibility of negation, the falsity of the hypothesis and, in some sense, the struggle between the possibility of the validity of the hypothesis and the possibility of its negation. All that is perfectly clear and explicit in Althusser's text. Althusser writes that it is impossible to understand the Marxist theory of history as form of hypothesis. I have written a small book under the title The Communist Hypothesis, and it puts forward a radical point of opposition to the Althusserian vision. I just want to say, in my defensive position, that the word communism, in the communist hypothesis, is not taken here as a category of the Marxist theory of history. It is not the signification of the word communism that is in question concerning the communist hypothesis. Rather, it is what I name an idea, the idea of communism. An idea is not a concept, so communist here is not a scientific concept in the field of the Marxist theory of history. This then reminds me of an intense moment in my personal relationship with Althusser. It was in the brief sequence between 1967 and 1969, with 1968 just in the middle. Before and after, things were not exactly the same in regard to my relationship to Althusser. This was also the moment of existence of the group Spinoza. The group Spinoza was a group composed by Althusser, with some friends of Althusser, all precisely reading Capital practically, engaged in the project to write a sort of synthesis of our epistemological convictions. The idea was to produce a fundamental book concerning theory, concerning what theory is, what constitutes an epistemological rupture and so on, to propose something like an educational book concerning all these sorts of themes. All that was destroyed by 1968 and, after that, by very strong political differences and struggles. But in discussions with Althusser at the time, I proposed, it was a part of my contribution to this inexistent book, to distinguish concept, notion, and category. And there is an echo of that in my work concerning the concept of model. 3. The idea was to reserve the use of concept for scientific discourse. So, the semantic unities of a scientific construction would be named concept, in order to reserve the use of notion for ideological discourse. So we would have scientific concepts and ideological notions. And, finally, I propose to reserve category for philosophical unities. And so my conclusion concerning the communist hypothesis is that, in this expression, communism cannot be a concept but communism can be a category. And, in fact, it remains to be shown that the word communism is and must be all at once a concept, a notion, and a category, and this is in fact the case. Communism is a concept as possible category of history. It is a notion because it has a very strong ideological value, a subjective value, and finally, It is a category in its more general and abstract philosophical meaning. I agree with Althusser's critique of the idea of the Marxist theory of history as a hypothesis, while I maintain in contrast that we can speak of a communist hypothesis. Allow me then to return to the passage from theory to theoretical practices, or to the adjectivization of the question of theory. Naturally, we have many theoretical practices. This adjectivization is also a pluralization. It is also the affirmation of the multiplicity of differences as such, which is substituted for the pair theory practice. Finally, all that is absorbed in the field of the multiplicity of different practices is this affirmation, this adjectivization in the form of the recognition of existence of a multiplicity of theoretical practices, the disappearance of a unified use of the word theory. And finally, is theory, as a concept, a possible concept, a name, a word, a category completely dissolved in the pure multiplicity of different practices? I think this is not exactly the case. And my reading of this text, that is reading capital, is to observe that this materialist movement, which is in fact the practical pluralization of the word theory, this materialist gesture, is not absolutely the disparition, disappearance, or destruction of some form of unity in the word theory. There is a trace of the vanishing of the word theory in the multiplicity of theoretical practices. This trace is the apparition and the use, in Althusser's text, of many classical terms of an epistemological nature. A sort of retour du refoulement, return of the repressed, the disparition of the unity of the word of the theory is paid for by the appearance of many words that lie within the vocabulary of the philosophy of science. And the most important of these appearances is that of knowledge. Knowledge appears as the name of what is produced by theoretical practice, because, naturally, if you have the transformation of the opposition theory, practice into theoretical practice, you must name the specific production of theoretical practice, and the specific production of theoretical practice is knowledge of some sort. So, finally, the definition of a theoretical practice is that it is the production, or rather the field of production, of knowledge. The production of knowledge is the hallmark of theoretical practice. The characteristic activity of theoretical practice is the production of knowledge. But to completely understand knowledge, we find the more surprising return of thinking. After the disparition of theory, we have the appearance of knowledge, and with the appearance of knowledge, we have the appearance of thinking, and thinking is the name for the element or the space of the process of the production of knowledge. It is the topological nature of the process of the production of knowledge. Where do we encounter this process of production, the production of knowledge? The answer is, this production of knowledge occurs in thinking. Thinking is, in some sense, the common characteristic of all theoretical practices, the common element, the common place. I quote, the production of knowledge. The production of knowledge is, in fact, the materialist definition of theoretical practice. A theoretical practice is, in fact, a production of knowledge, constitutes a process, naturally, a process and not an entity, that takes place entirely in thought. RCC 42, emphasis in original. To take place entirely in thought is a very dangerous expression, because to be entirely in thought is to be outside the real, outside the material real. If a practice is entirely in thought, this practice is separated from what is not thinking. Althusser is very cautious. Naturally, he is conscious of the difficulty and refuses an idealist interpretation which is a possibility. He writes that thinking is a real system articulated on the real world of a precise historical society. So, you see, after theory, we have theoretical practice. After theoretical practice, we have production of knowledge. After production of knowledge, we have the element of production of knowledge as thinking. And we are very close to the simple return of the opposition between thinking and real, and finally the return of the opposition between theory and practice. And so, it is a necessity to say no, it is really inside a practice, thinking itself, even the most abstract concept, is a real system articulated in the real world in a precise historical sense. And Althusser is also cautious in his use of different metaphors drawn from material technologies, to describe a production of knowledge within thinking. He uses phrases like thinking is the system, historically defined, of a thinking's apparatus, RCC 41, trans. Modified. So we have metaphors of a technological nature as a guarantee that, with that sort of thinking, we are not confronted by the return of the classical opposition between thinking and the real. In fact, in footnote 8 of the text, Althusser introduces a very strong doubt concerning that sort of procedure, the metaphorical technological description of the construction of knowledge. Why does a certain form of scientific discourse necessarily need the use of metaphors borrowed from non-scientific disciplines? RCC 529. So, as a very cautious philosopher, when Althusser finally returns to the relationship between practices and thinking, he adopts metaphors of a technological and materialist nature to prevent thinking from exceeding its materialist determination. And, in some sense, theory, here, is also subject to a metaphoric use. Theory here finds its materialist guarantee in the metaphoric use of words like production, mechanism, apparatus, and so on. We will return to this very interesting point. There is an evident risk. At this point, thinking can be an idealist price paid to the vanishing of theory in two senses. First, it is the return of the ghost. The disparition of theory into practice, its adjectivization via its redefinition as theoretical practice. Theoretical practice is the production of knowledge and the passage from production to knowledge. All that is completely inside thinking, remains exposed to the threat of idealism. This is necessarily so because if the production of knowledge occurs completely inside thinking, the question becomes, what is the difference between thinking and something else? If you determine the topological site of the process of theoretical practices as thinking, if then there is a closure of thinking, and there is a closure of thinking if you can say that the process of the production of knowledge is completely inside thinking, the question becomes, to what is this closure opposed? We thus confront the possible return of the opposition between theory and practice, in fact. That is, the return to what, at the beginning, it was necessary to destroy, in the form of a more radical ontological opposition, thinking and the real. Althusser affirms that the ultimate problem of his new materialism can be formulated as a question, by what mechanism does the process of knowledge, which takes place entirely in thought, produce the cognitive appropriation of the real object, which exists outside thought in the real world? RCC 57. This sentence is undoubtedly the most difficult in the whole text and the most problematic. It is a question, the radical and final question, in some sense, by what sort of mechanism, we have here the mechanical metaphor, does the process of knowledge, the process of knowledge is the process of the production knowledge, and the process of the production of knowledge is the definition of theoretical practice, which occurs completely in thinking, produce the cognitive appropriation of its real object, which exists outside thinking in the real world. We can grasp here, from a philosophical point of view, how the adjectivization of theory into the theoretical finally produces the return of the classical opposition between thinking and the real world. And we can also understand that the materialist guarantee of this idealist return is produced by the words process, production, system, apparatus, and mechanism, against the idealist function of an external guarantee. So, at the end of this first movement, we understand that the disparition of the dialectical vision of the relationship between theory and practice clearly produces a sort of materialist unity, but we also understand that finally to determine, inside this materialist unity, the particularity of theoretical practice by its difference from other forms of practice, we must introduce the very real risk of a return to the ontological opposition between thinking and the real, or thinking and the external world. There is another use of the passage from theory to the theoretical, which is of a more philosophical nature than the idealist risk. This is the reflexive point introduced by Althusser, when he wants to define what he named a correct theory of theories. At this point, Althusser is no longer pursuing a line of thinking that would provide a definition of theoretical practices but one that would provide a definition of a theory of theories. This provides him an alternative way to return to the question of theory or, more precisely, the theory of theoretical practices. Althusser is not concerned with the difference between theoretical practices and practices that are not theoretical, but with another opposition, to define theoretical practices from an immanent point of view, and not by differences from practices that are not theoretical. And that is why we must define a theory of theoretical practices, that is, a theory of theory, n'est-ce pas? That is why the definition is reflexive. More precisely, Althusser says, that which we seek is the history of the theoretical value of theoretical practices. The repetition of the word is very important, increasingly important, in Althusser's text. It signifies its reflexive determination, the history, the scientific history, of the theoretical value of theoretical practices. Perhaps the most important text, among all of the texts in Reading Capital, is a very compact one. I propose to call this history, the history of the theoretical value of theoretical practices, that is, in the end, the history of theories, the history of the theoretical as such, or the history of the production, and transformation, of what at a given moment in the history of knowledge constitutes the theoretical problematic to which are related all the existing validating criteria, and hence the forms required to give the order of theoretical discourse the force and value of a proof, RCC 50. So the idea is clear in this very complex expression. The idea is to discover, by scientific means, the possibility of a history not of particular theoretical practices, such as the history of mathematics, the history of history, the history of physics, and so on, but a history of the theoretical value of all theoretical practices. What then gives to theoretical practice its value in the sense of theoretical value? Why is theoretical practice in fact something like the production of a knowledge that has validity? If we adopt a philosophical vocabulary for a moment, it is the question of finding the scientific history of the mechanism by which theoretical practices contribute to knowledge, a knowledge that is really an appropriation of the real object. So this constitutes something like the possibility of a scientific or theoretical history of truths, truths being the internal, immanent value of theoretical practices. This much seems clear. The point is the singular signification of the theoretical itself. The passage from theory to the theoretical was a materialist passage, designed to reduce theory to practices. But after that, we have here the use of theoretical as a differential indicator, occurring at different levels. In total, we find 4 different uses of the adjective theoretical in this text, which is probably Althusser's most important epistemological project as he seeks to develop a scientific history of the theoretical as such. This is a new, materialist epistemology that sought to create the knowledge, the reason, the mechanism by which theoretical practice is useful to the real. In this project, theory and practice as well disappear. There is no theory, there is no practice in the text. We find only different variations on the theoretical. First, we have theoretical problematics. Problematics has been introduced before in the text of Althusser as, I quote, a definite theoretical structure, that is, the forms which determine the orientation of a problem. 26. So, it is a very important part of theoretical practice to always have a problematic, that is, a specific form of the problems that are posed in the theoretical practice itself. These Althusser defines as, the forms which determine the position of a problem, naturally, at a precise moment the history of the theoretical practice in question. And so, we know what a problematic is, a sort of philosophical metaphor, a sort of transcendental of theoretical practice, because a problematic is the rule by which there exist problems within a theoretical practice. Problematics is the general conception of what is a problem for any theoretical practice, precisely defined. And so, the theoretical structure, which is a theoretical structure of the problem within a theoretical practice, defines a problematic. But in this manner we are faced with the return of the adjective theoretical, given that here we encounter theoretical problematics. And so a problematic is defined by the theoretical, but the theoretical is simultaneously a definition of problematics. And so we have a circular use of problematics. This as well as the price paid for the disappearance of theory, that is, the theoretical must be the definition of theoretical practice, but also, within theoretical practice, the definition of the problematic of this specific theoretical practice occurs in the form of theoretical problematics. This constitutes a general lesson. When we substitute an adjective for a noun, we are forced to constantly use the adjective, which is not the case for the noun. So, to summarize, of all the nouns which stand in relationship to theoretical practice, and which are of a theoretical nature, we find problematics, theoretical problematics as well as, in the same passage, theoretical validity and theoretical discourse. So the point is that the theoretical is the general characteristic of all that happens in theoretical practice. So the adjective, in this case, circulates inside the definition, at all the levels of the definite object. And this is why we have the various uses of the theoretical problematics, theoretical validity, theoretical discourse. After theory, science, knowledge, and thinking, then, we note that the theoretical becomes a sort of circulating nomination. But the most remarkable aspect of the text is the presentation of the history of the theoretical as such. This is the point of departure for Althusser, and it is explicit in the text. There is no theory as such that can be opposed to practice as such. We cannot accept the abstract contradiction between theory and practice. In this sense, there is no opposition between an abstract theory as such and an abstract practice as such. But we have here the theoretical as such not as opposed to something else, for example, the practical as such but omnipresent in all the levels of theoretical practice. And perhaps this can be stated as a law: when you destroy the dialectical relationship, you produce the liberation of a word that is, finally, everywhere. And this is the case of the theoretical. Theoretical in Althusser's text is finally a word that has been liberated by the destruction of the dialectical couple. The term then comes to circulate, however, such that we have theoretical validity, theoretical discourse, theoretical problematics, as well as the theoretical as such. We can perform the same exercise in reference to another passage that I will discuss quickly. This is a passage that concerns an object much more common than the history of the theoretical as such, that is, what Althusser names the concept of the history of knowledge. We are now much closer to epistemological considerations of a classic nature. Here is Althusser: to go beyond the merely formal concept of the structure of theoretical practice, i.e., of the production of knowledges, we must work out the concept of the history of knowledge, the concepts of the different modes of theoretical production, most important the concepts of the modes of production of ideology and science, and the peculiar concepts of the different branches of theoretical production and of their relations, RCC 44. Once again, we encounter the invasion of the theoretical. I will quickly summarize this process in the passage. 1. Theoretical practice, that is, theory, in fact 2. After that, we have theoretical production 3. And finally, theoretical relationships. So, here again, we find that Althusser's project to substitute a unified materialist vision of knowledge is paid for by a sort of adjectivization without limit. At the beginning of Althusser's text, the word theory seems essential. It is in fact the name of the Maspero collection in which the book appears, the Theory collection. And so, theory is a sort of emblem, a sort of fetish of the radical movement that Althusser proposes, a proposal to completely transform the dominant conception of Marxism and, finally, the dominant conception of revolutionary politics itself. But immediately after, theory is subtracted from its classical opposition to practice. And this is a materialist gesture made against the dialectical. Next, theory is replaced by the theoretical in a process of adjectivization. And this is done under the law of difference, because this act of adjectivization opposes the dialectical pair of theory, practice, to create the possibility of defining theory as theoretical practice. This adjectivization provokes the apparition of a new conceptual context, but also, finally, the opposition between thinking and the real world, which is elaborated as an opposition between a knowledge object and a real object. The possibility Althusser pursues, in this point, is to say something like the following: within a Spinozist vision, and Althusser, in some sense, proposes this sort of vision, we have the real, but the general real must be understood as the Spinozist substance, that is, the totality of what exists. But our relationship to this totality always occurs via some attribute of the totality. And there exist two attributes within the totality, thinking and what is not thinking. In Spinoza, the two attributes are thought and extension, thinking and space, but we can modify all that and say, the substantial totality is the totality of practices, and there exist two different attributes of this totality, which express the same totality either in the form of thinking, of real thinking, or else in the form of objectivity, of the object. So, we have the difference between the knowledge object, completely inside thinking, and the real object, completely inside the real in the external sense of the term. And this is not the reproduction of a metaphysical dualism, but simply two attributes of the same generality, which states that all that exists in the form of practices. At least this is a possibility. In the end, the question of the interpretation of the whole text would be, we have the theoretical as an attributive or predicative determination of the real, and we have external objectivity, which is what is not completely within thinking, as a realization of the real, which is, in some sense, the same real. But the difficulty here is that, for Althusser, there is no relationship, point by point, between the two. For Spinoza, the solution is an expressive one: the two attributes, thinking and extension, are the expression of the same order, ordo et connectio idearum idem aac ordo et connectio rerum. Ideas, thinking, and things fall under the same law, under the same order. So, there is no problem of their difference, because there is no difference. In some sense, they belong to the same order, but the same order is expressed, is symbolized in two different forms. So there is no real problem of the relationship between the idea and the thing. The idea and the thing are in the same general order. Althusser, however, explicitly refuses that sort of solution. What we find in the Althusserian attempt to find a new materialism is first of all a rigorous objectivism concerning practices. Practices are the only form of the real. We have, after that, the transversality, the disposition, if you wish, via two attributes, in the Spinozist sense, thinking and the real. But thinking as thinking and real as real. Or thinking as immanent real, real as external real, but, for Althusser, there is no isomorphism, no parallelism, no relationship point by point between the two. It is false to say that they express the same order. I quote him on this point, as it is explicit: the production process of the object of knowledge takes place entirely in knowledge, and so completely within thinking, and is carried out according to a different order, which is different from the real order of real genesis. That organizes the process of production of a given real object, RCC 41. Here we have a categorical refusal of the Spinozist solution in which the two attributes are attributes of the same order. The orders are different. So there is a mystery, a final mystery, which is the final appropriation of the real object by the knowledge object that is a characteristic of scientific practice. Scientific practice is the practice in which there is in fact an appropriation of the real object by the knowledge object. We can name that truth, we can name it as we wish, but the fact is that we have a real appropriation, and this is precisely the difference between a scientific practice and an ideological practice, where we have instead images, false images of the real and not an appropriation of the real. That is the question, the mystery of the mechanism which is the world of Althusser, the mechanism by which is realized the function of cognitive appropriation of the real object by the means of its sought-after object or its knowledge object. What we can say is that this mystery is in fact the mystery of a relationship in which the formal existence of the knowledge object lies completely within thinking and the external existence of the real object stands as the real object of the knowledge object. I insist that, for Spinoza, this problem does not exist. Because there is in fact no relationship between the two, because they are of the same substance. But, for Althusser, the order is not the same, so there is in fact a real difficulty. And this difficulty, I am convinced, is in fact a Kantian difficulty. It is a difficulty, the solution of which is for Kant schematism. Schematism, in Kant, is precisely the mechanism by which the formal organization of the categories of knowledge are related to the external existence, which we cannot know, of the world. In Althusser, theory, theoretical nature, and so on, must be understood as a mixture of the immanent Spinozist vision of two attributes of the same real with this Kantian schematism. There is only one real, it is not an ontological dualism, but instead we find two attributes of the same substance but without parallelism, without identity of the order. This existence of two attributes, thinking object and real object, must be completed by a sort of materialist mechanism, a materialist schematism, in the sense of Kant. A mechanism, after all, which is absolutely enigmatic, and which is formulated by Althusser, as a question. Furthermore, we know that schematism is described by Kant himself as something enigmatic, something obscure. And so, we find in Althusser a mixture of something that stands in relation to the transcendental of Kant, alongside something clearly on the side of the materialism of Spinoza. In 1967 I wrote an essay on Althusser, Reading Capital, and Karl Marx. At the end of this essay, I said that the difficulty with reading Capital was that, in some sense, Althusser proposes a philosophical disposition, which can be summarized as an aspect of Kant in Spinoza. For and now, I discover that I have been saying the same thing, 46 years later. Thus my melancholic conclusion, in the end, a philosopher always says the same thing. The world changes but not the philosopher. It is why, perhaps, we are eternal. Notes 1. Louis Althusser, Etienne Balibar, Roger Establet, Pierre Macherey, and Jacques Rancière, Reading Capital, The Complete Edition, trans. Ben Brewster and David Fernbach, London, Verso, 2016. Further page references will be cited parenthetically in the text. 2. Alain Badiou, The Communist Hypothesis, New York, Verso, 2010. 3. Alain Badiou, Le Concept de Modèle, Introduction à une épistémologie matérialiste des mathématiques, Paris, Maspero, 1970. 4. Alain Badiou, The Recommencement of Dialectical Materialism, and the Adventure of French Philosophy, trans. Bruno Bastiles, New York, Verso, 2012. Chapter 2.